Anthony was a loving person, had a big heart.
Anthony was very charismatic. He was the type of person that people gravitated to. When I saw him coming through the door, I said, "Are you homicide?" He said yes, and then he told me that Anthony was gone. I felt like my skin wasn't touching me anywhere. I have never in my life felt that type of agony ever.
This person was a target. This wasn't a random act of violence.
There were two separate shooters shooting from the front and one from the back.
Police get another call about a fatal shooting, this time on the southeast side of town.
I could see my son. I knew it was him.
We need to look at that angle, that these could be related.
The never-ending cycle of revenge.
It might be sweet in the moment, but it leads to having to look over your shoulder for the rest of your life.
As the second biggest city in Texas, San Antonio encompasses diversity, both in its people and its neighborhoods.
San Antonio is built on a loop. It's a city that is in a big circle, and in that circle, there are siloed communities.
The northwest side of San Antonio, specifically close to the medical center area, is generally a quiet area. The med center is a good area to live in. There's also a university close by, so there's, college students that live there.
It's just before 2 a.m. on January 7th, 2020, when the San Antonio Police Department is alerted to a situation in the parking lot of an apartment complex on the northwest side.
We did receive 911 calls from residents about a shooting. Reports where there were several shots fired.
Officers respond.
They did find a victim in the parking lot who had suffered apparent gunshot wounds.
Bystanders are attempting first aid on the young male. But damage is too severe.
Officers find that he is dead on arrival. There's nothing that can be done to save him.
Soon, homicide detectives arrive.
One thing that really stuck out to me was the fact that he had socks on his feet, but he didn't have shoes on. This told me that he probably lived in the apartment complex.
Once the medical examiner arrives, they're able to search through the victim's pockets to see if he happens to have any sort of identification on him, but unfortunately, he didn't.
A bystander speaks up, claiming to have seen the victim frequently coming and going from one of the apartments.
One of the witnesses pointed out they believed it was his vehicle. And so we ran the registration on that and came up with the name Anthony Sanks.
Born in 1989, Anthony's early years were spent on the move.
Anthony was born at Maxwell Air Force Base. He was my oldest son when I was an airman in the Air Force. I got orders to another base. I was stationed in England, Upper Heyford, England, and we moved there where we lived for about 1.5 years. After that, I separated from the military and then moved to San Antonio, Texas.
Eventually, Anthony's mother gave birth to 2 more sons.
Anthony, he had 2 little brothers, loved them to death. He was definitely like that father figure.
Anthony was a very, very active child. I learned very early on that he was full of energy. He loved football, and as he got older in high school, he became a high school football star. He was a running back, and he broke records.
He was a little more athletic than most of the guys at his school. Like they looked up to him and expected big plays from him, and he delivered that.
Anthony's hopes and dreams in high school was to be a football player. He wanted to play professionally. When he came to the awareness that he had to go to college and do well in college in order to do that, I feel like his dreams shifted to music and entertainment. Anthony wanted to be a rapper. He wanted to do other, things in the entertainment industry. And Patrick was the one who kind of stepped out there and learned how the business worked and then tried to draw his friends, Anthony included, into the pattern that was going to work for what they were trying to accomplish. So Patrick was his manager.
I believe that music was a way of him to stay connected to Chris. I believe that music was a way for him to express himself, his emotions, his feelings, what he was going through. A lot of the music that he wrote was based off of real life situations that he was experiencing.
Anthony came up with the idea that he wanted to do a song with the two of us. He wanted to rap and then wanted me to sing. So he wrote the lyrics, and then I just came up with a hook to it and sang behind it. We went to a studio in town where we put down the very first recording. He was over the hills, excited to be in the studio with me.
The song is actually called Mama. That song was real near and dear to his heart. He really was passionate about having a song with his mom on there singing.
Anthony's talent was clear, but his biggest fans would always be his family.
His two little brothers copied him because he had the braids first, and then he ended up getting dreads, and then they got the dreads. But yeah, he wanted to see them succeed. He wanted to, when he learned things, he wanted to pass it down to them. His mama, that was his baby. He loved her more than anything on this earth.
My relationship with Anthony was a day-to-day. If I didn't talk to him every day, I spoke to him every other day. We were in constant communication about whatever was going on in his life at that particular time. And I am the type of mom that, I want to make sure that my kids are okay.
But on the evening of January 7th, 2020, police have tentatively identified Anthony as the victim of a shooting.
I could see that the victim had been shot multiple times. I couldn't tell where exactly. And we can't move the victims around. We have to wait for the medical examiner's investigator to get there.
Investigators hope one of the onlookers saw what happened.
Officers found that they were not eyewitnesses, but were ear witnesses to the incident. These individuals reported hearing multiple gunshots and then hearing screeching tires that were leading away from the apartment complex.
For police, that scene was really difficult to work. It's pretty dark, so the police were relying very heavily on their own lighting techniques by the police car lights.
They're looking for anything that could potentially lead them to find out what happened to this victim.
There was a cell phone near the victim. That being there told me that was probably the victim's cell phone. We weren't able to get into the cell phone. It was locked. So we didn't have a code, an access code or passcode to get into it.
And this could be something that ends up being a huge piece of evidence.
I look at the rest of the scene and I notice the shell casings that are laying about. There were about 9 markers locating shell casings. So there were 9 shell casings near the victim's body.
And they were all close to the body, suggesting that they were close range.
They found several shell casings on his body and around the body, really emphasizing the amount of firepower.
The police had a lot of work to do to figure out what exactly had happened here.
This wasn't a random act of violence.
On January 7th, 2020, San Antonio investigators are looking into the shooting death of Anthony Sanks on the city's northwest side. After hours of working the scene in the dark, investigators head back to the station.
When we got back to our office, we did some research on the registration. We were able to get a photograph of the registered owner of one of the vehicles, and it did look like the victim at the scene. So around 4 or 5 hours after we've released the scene, we go back because now we have daylight hours. We go back to look for any cameras in the area. We do notice that there are some around the office, which is located at an entry-exit point for the apartment complex. We had to wait for employees to show up. When they did show up, they confirmed they did have recorded footage of the area in front of the office building, which would show us vehicles coming and going. We were able to look at the footage. We did notice one vehicle come in, a small dark-colored SUV, and we were able to see it actually leave after the shooting. Couldn't get a license plate, couldn't see the people inside. It was a black Jeep Compass. A hubcap was missing off one of the tires, and then it had a broken taillight on the back.
They knew now that that vehicle was at the apartment complex at the time of the shooting. They were able to match up the time codes and know that that was most likely the suspect vehicle at that point.
When the officers were getting the surveillance video, they were also able to inquire as to the residents of the apartment that the witness has identified as seeing the victim going in and out of.
We knocked. The occupant did answer. It was a young female. She invited us in. She explained to us that she did know Mr. Sanks and that she was allowing him to stay there. She explained that she was a lifelong friend of his. The night before, she had gone out with some friends, did some drinking, came home around 12:40 a.m. She had bought some food.
The last time that she had seen the victim, he was still playing video games in the living room.
She explained that she's a very heavy sleeper, said she didn't hear anything as far as gunshots. She didn't know he was even gone until we knocked on the door and woke her up.
The roommate tells investigators that she knows Anthony's mother.
She currently was working with Mr. Sanks' mother at her hair salon, and she gave us that information of where that was located. And she told us that his mother would actually be there at that point, opening up for the day. We left the apartment complex and we wanted to get to her as soon as we could. We wanted her to know as soon as possible what happened.
When I saw him coming through the door, I said, "Are you homicide?" He said, "Yes." I said, "I just need you to say it." He said, "I need you to sit down." I said, "No, I need you to say it." And then he told me that Anthony was gone. At that point, I felt like my skin wasn't touching me anywhere. I have never in my life felt that type of agony ever.
The toughest part of this job is notifying a family when they've lost a loved one. You could automatically tell the love lost for this woman.
I did not know of anyone who would want to gun my son down in a parking lot in the middle of the night. I didn't know of anyone that would want to do this.
She didn't know of any problems he would have had with anyone, but we really needed more help. We told her we did have his phone, or we believed we had his phone, and we asked her if she knew the passcode for it.
We gave him the code to the phone, and that was it. And I asked him, "Please, I need you to find out who did this to my son." And he says, "I'm gonna do my very best."
Getting into the cell phone that we believed was Mr. Sanks' phone was vital. We knew that he left that apartment and went out in the parking lot. We knew he didn't have shoes on, so he was probably going out there to meet someone he knew. That phone was probably going to tell us who he was communicating with and why he walked out in the parking lot.
Investigators check the last activity on the phone.
They're able to locate on Facebook Messenger that the victim was going to meet someone right before he was murdered. And they were able to get that Facebook Messenger handle. There was a handle NHC Bobo that the victim was communicating with.
We knew that person came over. We knew they were communicating with Mr. Sanks. And we knew Mr. Sanks went out there to meet NHC Bobo in the parking lot. NHC Bobo was going to be someone we needed to find.
Detectives investigating the death of Anthony Sanks get their first break when they access phone messages sent to Anthony moments before he was gunned down.
Police now realize that they need to locate whoever this NHC Bobo is because, they were in direct communication with Anthony almost right before he was murdered.
Hopeful to uncover NHC Bobo's true identity, investigators put the word out.
Homicide detectives rely on officers that are working undercover, working in specific units to be able to assist them in determining the identity of individuals that have nicknames.
While they wait to see if any leads turn up, detectives attend Anthony's autopsy.
I went to the Bexar County Medical Examiner's office. This case was very complex because he had multiple gunshot wounds, and they were coming from different directions.
The medical examiner was able to identify 10 gunshot wounds. In this case, the victim was shot several times, 2 times, I believe, in the back, and then 8 entrance wounds in the front. It was safe to assume that there were 2 separate shooters.
The 2 shooters, the multiple gunshot wounds, and the fact that Anthony was lured to the parking lot all support a new theory.
This wasn't a random act of violence. We had to believe this was definitely a targeted hit or a targeted murder.
As far as who targeted Anthony, that remains a mystery.
We still didn't know who NHC Bobo was. So on January 14th, about a week after Mr. Sanks is murdered, I'm contacted by one of our detectives that works in an undercover capacity, works on the street. He had an informant come forward to him who had information about the murder of Mr. Sanks. He told me that this informant explained to him that NHC Bobo is an individual by the name of John Anthony Sheringhausen. We also found that there were text messages on Mr. Sanks' phone from John Sheringhausen. So we knew we had the right guy communicating with Mr. Sanks. The detective also gave me more information about some things that happened which might have been the reason why the murder happened.
The detective explains there was a beef between John Sheringhausen, Anthony Sanks, and a third man, Andrew Salazar.
Supposedly, Anthony Sanks' murder stemmed from a previous incident that had happened in June 2019. Andrew Salazar's home had gotten shot up in a drive-by shooting down on the south side of town. According to rumors on the street, Sheringhausen supposedly was the one who had committed that drive-by shooting.
So we looked into the shooting that occurred at Andrew Salazar's house in June of 2019. He was not present when the shooting happened. His family was there.
We just got home. It was just me, my wife, and my granddaughter. I heard popping noise, but I really didn't know they were shooting. My wife, she heard it louder than I did. She told me, hey, they shot at the house. I went outside and I looked. This probably was like a 12 or 13 rounds probably. And I got scared. We had to move out real quick, so we moved out within a month.
They didn't see who did it. They couldn't say who did it. We didn't know, if they were truly the targeted people or if it was a random thing that maybe caught in the crossfire or someone picked the wrong house to shoot up.
Investigators hope that one man might be able to shed light on the incident.
Talking to John Scherenhausen was my big goal. Find out what he knew, what information he had. He had a lot of things to explain.
Investigators obtain a warrant for Scherenhausen's arrest, but he is nowhere to be found.
We'll solicit the assistance from the U.S. Marshal Service. We had people from those agencies helping us look for John Scherenhausen.
Then, just 2 weeks after Anthony Sanks' death, more bloodshed.
So officers are dispatched to a 911 call where neighbors in the area heard multiple gunshots and saw two males running from a vehicle that was still at the location, and they could see an individual slumped over the steering wheel.
Officers respond, and they were able to then establish that the victim was Andrew Salazar.
Just 2 weeks after Anthony Sanks was shot 10 times in a parking lot, San Antonio police get word another man allegedly connected to the case has just been gunned down. Detectives are processing the scene where Andrew Salazar was shot dead inside his truck.
There was a bystander among the people who were there who, by chance, was going to meet up with the victim. The bystander identified the truck as the car that Andrew Salazar frequently drove. And that's how police were able to then run the plates and identify the next of kin.
His girlfriend called my wife and told her, "Have you talked to Andrew?" And my wife told him no. I goes, "There was a shooting." She gave us the address, and I kept trying to call him on the phone, and he wasn't answering. It was a pretty long drive going out there. I saw the truck. I used to work for the police department, so one of the officers recognized me there. And so they let me kind of go closer than I was supposed to. I could see my son. I knew it was him.
Andrew Salazar was born on March 22, 1991 in Fort Worth, Texas. The Salazar family relocated to San Antonio when Anthony was 3. That's where Anthony grew up, the third of 5 children.
They were all a year apart, but they were just siblings. They would get along with each other, and sometimes they would fight with each other. We're a real close-knit family.
Andrew was still a teenager himself when he started his own family.
Him and his girlfriend were real young. They were like close to like 17, I think, 17, 16. At that time, they were living with us when she was pregnant. So they did live with us for pretty much like probably 2 years.
Despite his youth, Andrew was a devoted father who wanted to provide for his son.
Every school function he would go to, whenever they had the field trips, he would go to the field trips. He would be organizing all his birthday parties. His goal was to establish a business, either doing any kind of, remodeling or construction or anything like that. I mean, he had a lot of endeavors. He believed in doing a lot of things, but I guess he never had a chance to do it.
On January 22nd, 2020, Andrew's dreams are cut short when he's gunned down inside his truck.
Me and my wife were there, and we were crying. We called my kids. My other 2 sons got there too.
As Andrew's family attempts to process the sudden loss, detectives get to work.
There was a witness identified who she was coming home from work, and when she arrives at her house, she notices this pickup truck stopped in front of her home.
She sees brake lights first, then flashers. Then the next thing she hears is gunshots, and she observes 2 males running from the car with hoodies, both running in a northern direction.
Word of Andrew's death reaches Detective Size, who has been working the shooting death of Anthony Sanks for the past 2 weeks.
When I found out who the victim was, Andrew Salazar, I contacted that detective and told him, hey, I believe your case is going to be related to my case involving the murder of Anthony Sanks.
With Andrew Salazar dead, investigators are more eager than ever to speak with John Scheringhausen. On February 10th, 16 days after the second murder, investigators catch a break.
John Scheringhausen was found. He was with a friend. They stopped him in a vehicle. He did speak with me. We were focused on the Anthony Sanks murder. He did say he knew who Sanks was, but denied knowing anything about the shooting as far as who did it and how. And then he's confronted with some of the evidence that we have. We knew he was communicating with him. He knew he was kind of cornered and he had to explain his way out. So he tried.
Scheringhausen says that Andrew Salazar believed Anthony Sanks was responsible for the drive-by. And he was right.
He said that he actually did that shooting under the direction of Anthony Sanks, and that Andrew Salazar found out that it was him and confronted him about it.
Andrew hit him with a threat.
Scheringhausen explained that Andrew Salazar told him, "You will help me get back at Anthony Sanks, and if you don't, then I'll kill you."
But Scheringhausen says he didn't accompany Andrew Salazar to kill Anthony Sanks. Instead, he claims another man took on that role.
He said that we needed to get Anthony Jiggy Nash.
Scheringhausen claims his role was limited to loaning the man his phone so they could use it to lure Anthony Sanks outside.
Anthony Sanks was his good friend. He tells detectives he was forced by Andrew Salazar to give over his phone, and that Andrew Salazar had been the one that had messaged the victim, setting the victim up to be murdered, that it wasn't him. He tells detectives that Anthony Nash and Andrew Salazar took his phone and left in Anthony Nash's vehicle to go over and set Anthony Sanks up to be murdered.
I asked him, "Can you give me some more specific detail about the vehicle?" And he stops and thinks, and he says, "Well, yeah, it had a broken taillight, the broken driver's side taillight." When he said it was a black Jeep Compass, we were able to take the information he gave, compare it to the video. It was a Jeep, just like he was explaining to us.
Detectives start to look a little bit more into Anthony Nash. They do discover that his vehicle registration matches the vehicle that they saw on surveillance leaving the apartment complex the night of Anthony Sanks' murder. They realize some of the things that Scheringhausen is telling them is actually true.
John Scheringhausen claims he was not there when Anthony Nash and Andrew Salazar gunned Anthony Sanks down. But investigators aren't so sure he is being honest about his role.
He gave very detailed information about what happened when they got there. That Sanks came out, and that Nash got out and started shooting him, and that Drew came around and also shot Anthony Sanks, but claiming he wasn't there. To have that kind of detail, we didn't think people involved would tell him in that good of detail what happened. So we knew that he was there.
Investigators confront him. Instead of coming clean, Scheringhausen changes the subject.
Knowing that he was getting really deeper and deeper cornered as far as Anthony Sanks' murder, I think he tried to help himself by providing information about Andrew Salazar's murder.
The information he gives the detectives about that is that Anthony Nash, who he called Jiggy, got really nervous after Anthony Sanks' murder and believed that Andrew Salazar was setting him up to turn him into the police. And so Anthony Nash got concerned about this and that he was the one who killed Andrew Salazar.
He again denied that he was there. He claimed that Andrew was murdered by Anthony Nash. Nash pulled a gun out and shot Salazar in the truck. And then fled after that.
Detectives make sure Sheringhausen knows they aren't buying his claims of innocence.
To have that kind of detail, we knew that he was there, he was in that Jeep. After interviewing John Sheringhausen, he was told that he was under arrest for the murder of Anthony Sanks.
Investigators attempt to track down Anthony Nash.
They were unable to locate him. They spoke with his father, who said that soon after these murders that he had been in a mental institution. And after the hospitalization had gone to Louisiana.
We didn't know where he was. We had him in the system. We had a bolo that we needed to speak to him.
Finally, after over a year of looking, investigators get word that Anthony Nash is back in San Antonio.
We had just enough probable cause in the Anthony Sanks case to arrest Nash. Just enough. It came down to Sheringhausen, what he provided to us, able to see that vehicle that was involved. We were able to say, that we knew Nash had that type of vehicle. Arrest warrant was obtained on July 21st of 2021, and he was arrested at his mother's apartment.
When detectives went to speak with him, he was unwilling to give any information.
Even with 2 arrests, detectives still have work to do.
After Anthony Nash is arrested and charged with the murder of Anthony Sanks, I started to dive more into the Andrew Salazar case. If I could get closer to arresting Nash for that murder as well.
Investigators revisit a piece of evidence that had been handed over by Andrew's father. After his son's vehicle was released back to the family, Jesus Salazar found something.
And I found some keys to a vehicle in the truck. So that's what I recovered those, and I called the detective, and I told him, I got these keys.
He found the key in there, didn't know whose it was or what it was for, and thought it might be important, so that's why he gave it to police. He said he also noticed in a social media photograph of Sheringhausen and Nash together that it looked like the same key that was hanging on the belt loop of Anthony Nash.
Nash had those keys that were inside my truck. I said, look, those are the same keys, keychain. So I send the picture to the detective.
It was exactly like the key that you could see in the photograph that's hanging on the belt loop of Anthony Nash.
The key was great evidence to show that he was involved.
It's good evidence, but I wanted more. So my next step was then to get phone records.
They were able to get the phone records for Anthony Nash, and they were able to determine that his phone was in the area at the time that Andrew Salazar was murdered.
At this point, after I get those phone records, now I have enough. I have enough to say that Anthony Nash was definitely involved in the murder of Andrew Salazar. So a charge was made against him in that case as well.
Investigators believe more players in the 2 killings remain unidentified. But with no witnesses and no one talking, they focus on Nash and Sheringhausen. A theory about Sheringhausen takes shape.
It was starting to feel more and more like John Sheringhausen was putting this all together, and that it was some type of a power play by him to get rid of these 2 guys so he could maybe get a bigger name for himself on the streets.
But when it comes to the second crime, investigators cannot prove his involvement.
A charge was not brought against him in the Andrew Salazar case.
Law enforcement also cannot prove that Sheringhausen fired any shots the day Anthony Sanks was killed. But prosecutors are confident they can still hold him accountable.
We relied almost exclusively on the cell phone and Facebook Messenger evidence that we had. Anything that an individual would do to promote, assist in the plan or in the carrying out of a murder makes that person just as guilty as an individual who shoots and kills.
As John Sheringhausen's trial approaches, prosecutors piece together what they believe took place the day Anthony Sanks was gunned down.
I believe that Andrew Salazar was out for revenge and talked John Sheringhausen into helping him set up Anthony Sanks to be killed. I believe that Anthony Nash drove them over there to kill Anthony Sanks. I believe that once at the location, I think that John Sheringhausen got out of the vehicle, that Anthony Sanks went to go and meet him, and then Andrew Salazar got out and began shooting, and then John Sheringhausen began shooting too.
But when Sheringhausen's trial begins in October 2021, prosecutors must stick to what they can prove.
I could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was one of the shooters without any eyewitnesses, without anybody being able to say that he had told them that he had murdered the victim. However, we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the individual was at a very minimum a party to the murder. There was no getting out of him being present with his phone when Anthony Sanks was murdered. At the same time his phone was messaging the victim, he was also messaging a girlfriend, referencing that he was going to hit a lick. Hitting a lick either means murdering someone or robbing someone. As soon as he was done, he was gonna go over and meet her. Those messages were sent right before the murder. And so based on that information, we knew without a doubt that he was present at the murder. He aided, he planned, he assisted in this murder, and that's why he was guilty. As soon as that evidence was presented, his attorney was approaching me, telling me that his client had changed his mind. His client had decided to change his plea to guilty.
It became so damning that Mr. Sheringhausen had no choice. And that's when he, of course, changed his mind.
The judge sentenced the defendant, John Sheringhausen, to 40 years in prison for the murder of Anthony Sanks.
In February 2023, Anthony Nash accepts a deal.
I did not believe that Anthony Nash was a shooter in the Anthony Sanks murder. I believe that he was the getaway driver. Anthony Nash's vehicle was driven into and out of the parking lot, and the information from the witnesses at the scene, the shots were very quickly followed by screeching tires. So I did not believe that the person who drove the vehicle away from the scene was one of the individuals who had been out shooting. I believe that his involvement, his culpability was lesser. We offered him 20 years in prison to run concurrently on both murders. And ultimately, he accepted that instead of going to a trial.
We never were able to clearly define that, but I'm pretty satisfied with the fact that John Sheringhausen manipulated all these people, constructed this entire thing, and made it happen. And because of his actions, 2 people lost their lives, 2 young people lost their lives, and 2 families were affected forever by it.
I don't think that closure exists.
There is a terrifying question that quietly follows every human being throughout life, a question we rarely dare to ask ourselves because the answer is simply too unsettling to accept. What if the most dangerous person in the room is not the one who looks dangerous at all? What if evil does not arrive wearing a mask, carrying a weapon, or speaking with anger in its voice? What if evil smiles politely, shakes your hand, remembers your name, and earns your trust long before you ever realize who it truly is? On a freezing winter morning in Ontario, Canada, the air hung heavy with silence. Snow covered the roads like an untouched blanket, absorbing every sound and creating a deceptive sense of peace. Houses stood quietly beneath grey skies while people moved through their ordinary routines without the slightest suspicion that a predator had been living among them for years. Somewhere behind those walls, coffee machines hummed, alarm clocks rang, and families prepared for another normal day. Yet hidden beneath this ordinary world was a double life so disturbing that even seasoned investigators would struggle to comprehend it. The man at the center of this story was not an unemployed drifter. He was not a known criminal. He was not someone society had already pushed into the shadows. He was one of the most respected military officers in all of Canada. He wore a decorated uniform. He commanded thousands of personnel. He flew aircraft carrying world leaders. He was trusted with immense responsibility. People saluted him. People admired him. People saw him as a symbol of discipline, intelligence, and honor. But while the world applauded his achievements during daylight, another version of him emerged after dark. A version that quietly drove through neighborhoods searching for vulnerable women. A version that memorized routines, studied houses, and entered bedrooms while innocent people slept. A version that photographed stolen underwear as trophies and carefully catalogued every act of violation as if preserving memories from a beloved hobby. This is not simply the story of murder. It is the story of deception perfected over years. It is the story of a predator who understood one powerful truth better than most criminals ever do. People rarely fear those they respect. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in a crowded room during a military ceremony. Cameras flash. Uniforms shine beneath bright lights. Conversations are warm and professional. Among the distinguished guests stands a man whose entire life appears admirable. He carries himself with confidence. His posture is impeccable. His smile is controlled and polite. If he walks toward you, nothing inside your brain activates a warning signal. You would not clutch your belongings tighter. You would not feel afraid. In fact, you might feel honored if he stopped to talk to you. That is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this case. There were no obvious monsters here. No dramatic outbursts. No visible signs announcing danger. There was only an ordinary face hiding extraordinary darkness. And for years, nobody knew. The people closest to him did not know. His colleagues did not know. His neighbors did not know. Entire communities slept peacefully while he carefully balanced two identities, each one feeding the other. By day, he built trust. By night, he hunted. Somewhere along the line, a hidden obsession that began with secret invasions of privacy evolved into something much worse. Investigators would later discover that his crimes did not explode into existence overnight. Evil rarely does. It grows quietly. It takes small steps before it learns to run. It tests boundaries before it destroys them entirely. First came the trespassing. Then the thefts. Then the fantasies. Then the escalation. Every successful act reinforced a dangerous belief inside his mind. He could get away with it. He was smarter than everyone else. He was untouchable. And perhaps the most chilling realization is that for a very long time, he was right. He did get away with it. While police searched for answers, he attended meetings. While families mourned victims, he offered condolences. While investigators desperately assembled timelines, he calmly returned to work. Imagine carrying two separate worlds inside your head every single day. One world built upon prestige, respect, and national service. Another built upon secret rituals, violence, and obsession. How does a person live that way? How do they compartmentalize reality so completely that they can walk from a murder scene into a professional environment without revealing a single crack in their facade? These questions would eventually haunt not only detectives but an entire country. Because once the truth emerged, Canadians were forced to confront a disturbing possibility. Maybe evil does not always announce itself through chaos. Maybe sometimes it succeeds because it understands order better than everyone else. The winter of 2010 would become one of the darkest chapters in modern Canadian criminal history. A young woman named Jessica Lloyd suddenly vanished from her home in Belleville, Ontario. There were no signs of a random street attack. No witnesses screaming into the night. No dramatic chase scenes. There was only absence. One moment she was there. Then she was gone. Her house remained standing exactly where it always had. Her belongings remained inside. The world around her continued moving forward while her own future abruptly disappeared. Family members waited for answers that never came. Friends desperately retraced memories, hoping to uncover something overlooked. Investigators rushed to collect every possible clue before time erased them forever. The clock began ticking immediately because every missing person case carries an unbearable truth. The first hours are precious, and every minute lost can become irreversible. Yet what authorities could not yet understand was that this disappearance was connected to a hidden pattern stretching back years. Somewhere in Ontario, a man was watching all of this unfold with an expressionless face. He already knew the answers everyone else desperately sought. He knew where fear would spread next. He knew which evidence existed and which evidence had already been hidden. Most horrifying of all, he knew how to blend into the chaos because he had spent years practicing exactly that. But predators, no matter how intelligent they believe themselves to be, almost always make one fatal mistake. They begin trusting their own myth. They start believing they are invisible. They become addicted not only to their crimes but to the thrill of escaping consequences. That addiction is dangerous because eventually confidence transforms into arrogance, and arrogance creates opportunity. Yet before investigators would reach that turning point, before a single tire track changed everything, before an interrogation room would become the stage for one of the most famous psychological collapses in Canadian history, an entire nation would first experience disbelief. Because the name attached to this nightmare was almost impossible to accept. Russell Williams. The name itself sounded ordinary. There was no immediate menace attached to it. No infamous reputation preceding him. Just a respected military commander whose achievements could fill pages of honorable accomplishments. But hidden inside computers and storage devices, hidden inside carefully preserved collections of stolen personal items, hidden inside photographs nobody was ever supposed to see, lay evidence of an unimaginable secret life. Every object represented a boundary crossed. Every image represented a victim whose sense of safety had been shattered. Every detail exposed a disturbing need for control that continued escalating until human lives themselves became part of the collection. There is something uniquely terrifying about crimes committed inside private homes because homes represent safety. They are where people remove their armor. They are where people stop pretending to be strong. They are where people sleep without fear. To invade that space is to attack something deeper than physical security. It is to attack trust itself. And Russell Williams understood that intimately. He studied routines. He observed patterns. He transformed ordinary neighborhoods into hunting grounds without anyone realizing it. Somewhere out there, while streetlights glowed and snow gently fell from the sky, he moved through darkness with terrifying patience. Every successful intrusion fed an illusion of superiority. Every escape strengthened his confidence. He was building a secret empire of control while the world celebrated his public achievements. Yet no empire built upon deception can survive forever. Sooner or later, reality catches up. Sooner or later, details stop aligning. Sooner or later, evidence begins speaking louder than reputation. And when that moment finally arrived, the collapse would be astonishing to witness. A man once entrusted with extraordinary responsibilities would find himself sitting beneath fluorescent lights, stripped of the protective shield he had relied upon for years. His composure would begin to crack. His eyes would change. The confidence would slowly drain from his face. Piece by piece, the carefully constructed illusion would crumble in front of investigators who refused to be intimidated by rank, prestige, or status. But that confrontation is still ahead of us. For now, we remain at the beginning, standing in the cold silence of Ontario, staring into a mystery that has yet to reveal its true face. Somewhere behind every salute, every award, every handshake, another story was already unfolding in secret. A story of obsession. A story of power. A story that would force an entire country to ask itself a terrifying question that remains relevant even today. If someone like Russell Williams could hide in plain sight for so long, how many masks do we unknowingly walk past every single day? Long before his name would become synonymous with one of Canada's most shocking criminal cases, long before investigators would search through mountains of evidence trying to understand how one man could sustain two completely different lives, there was simply a place, a system, and a reputation that nobody thought to question. To understand how this story became possible, we first have to step into the world that allowed Russell Williams to thrive for decades without attracting suspicion. We have to travel to Ontario, Canada, a province known for its vast landscapes, its quiet communities, and its carefully structured way of life. Ontario is a place where small towns and military communities often coexist in a rhythm built around trust. People recognize familiar faces at grocery stores. Neighbors wave to one another while clearing snow from driveways during long winters. Doors are not always locked immediately after sunset because people tend to believe they know the individuals living around them. It is a place where routine creates comfort. Every morning begins almost exactly the same way. Cars slowly emerge from garages. Exhaust drifts upward into the freezing air. Coffee cups rest inside cup holders as workers head toward offices, schools, hospitals, and military facilities. There is a quiet predictability to life here, and predictability often creates a sense of security. But security itself can become a dangerous illusion. About 2 hours east of Toronto sits one of Canada's most important military installations, Canadian Forces Base Trenton. To outsiders, it may simply look like another military base surrounded by roads, aircraft hangars, and administrative buildings. But for Canada, CFB Trenton represented something far more significant. It was one of the central hubs of the Royal Canadian Air Force, responsible for transportation missions both nationally and internationally. Military aircraft constantly moved in and out of the base, carrying personnel, equipment, humanitarian aid, and sometimes some of the world's most influential figures. Within this environment, discipline was not merely encouraged. It was expected. Rank mattered. Professionalism mattered. Reputation mattered. Every salute carried symbolic weight. Every promotion represented years of dedication and sacrifice. Those who climbed the ranks successfully were often viewed as examples for others to follow. It was within this world that Russell Williams built his public identity. If someone had met him for the first time before his arrest, there was very little that would have triggered alarm. He spoke calmly. He dressed impeccably. He projected confidence without arrogance. Colleagues described him as intelligent and highly organized. He possessed the kind of presence that made people assume competence before he even opened his mouth. Throughout his military career, he accumulated achievements that few people could rival. He joined the Canadian military in 1987 and steadily advanced through the ranks. He flew aircraft carrying governors-general, prime ministers, and even members of the British royal family. Every successful assignment reinforced an image of reliability. Every promotion strengthened the public perception that he was exactly the kind of person society should admire. By 2009, he had reached an extraordinary level of professional accomplishment. He became commander of CFB Trenton, one of the most prestigious positions within the Royal Canadian Air Force. For many military officers, such an appointment would represent the pinnacle of an honorable career. Becoming commander meant more than receiving a title. It meant becoming a symbol. Thousands of military personnel looked toward him for leadership. Communities surrounding the base associated his position with integrity and responsibility. Yet what nobody realized was that the very characteristics helping him succeed professionally were also helping him conceal a hidden life. Russell Williams was methodical. He paid attention to details. He was disciplined. He understood planning. He understood routine. He understood human behavior. These are valuable traits inside military environments. In the wrong hands, however, they can become tools for predation. At the same time, beyond the gates of military installations, another world existed. Belleville and the surrounding communities represented the kind of towns many people dream about when imagining peaceful Canadian life. Streets were lined with modest homes. Trees framed neighborhoods that transformed dramatically with each season. Summers brought green lawns and open windows. Autumn covered roads with orange leaves. Winter buried entire communities beneath heavy layers of snow. There was beauty everywhere. But beauty often hides vulnerability. Unlike large metropolitan cities where anonymity dominates daily life, smaller communities depend heavily on familiarity. People learn each other's routines without even trying. The woman who leaves for work at 7 every morning. The couple who walk their dog every evening at 6. The young professional who returns home after sunset carrying grocery bags. These details become part of the landscape itself. Most people never consider such routines dangerous because ordinary life depends upon repetition. Unfortunately, predators also understand repetition. They know that habits create opportunities. Somewhere inside this peaceful environment, Russell Williams was learning exactly that. By approximately 2007, his secret life was already gaining momentum. At first, he was not a murderer. That fact is important because many people mistakenly imagine monsters appearing fully formed from the beginning. In reality, criminal escalation is often gradual. Boundaries erode over time. Small acts become larger ones. Risk tolerance increases with every successful offense. Investigators would later discover that Williams had developed a disturbing obsession centered around invading women's private spaces. Under the cover of darkness, he drove through neighborhoods searching for targets. He selected homes carefully. He paid attention to architecture, visibility, and escape routes. He watched patterns. He learned schedules. Then he would wait. Night after night, Ontario's neighborhoods transformed into hunting grounds hidden beneath silence. Imagine a residential street during winter. Snow muffles footsteps. Streetlights cast pale circles onto frozen sidewalks. Curtains close one by one as families settle into bed. From the outside, every house looks peaceful. But somewhere among them is a man sitting inside a vehicle, studying lives that are not his own. He is not looking for money. He is not interested in electronics. He is interested in people. More specifically, he is interested in control. Control over privacy. Control over boundaries. Control over fear itself. He would eventually break into dozens of homes. He stole intimate personal belongings, particularly underwear and clothing items belonging to women. But he did not simply take them. He documented everything. He photographed himself wearing stolen garments. He organized his collection meticulously. He treated every invasion like an archived accomplishment. This was not impulsive behavior. It was ritualistic behavior. Every detail mattered to him. Every memory was preserved. Every risk became part of an elaborate fantasy world existing parallel to his respectable public identity. The contrast was staggering. During daylight hours, he attended meetings, signed documents, supervised military operations, and interacted with colleagues who respected him deeply. At night, he became someone else entirely. This duality remains one of the most difficult aspects for criminal psychologists to comprehend. How does someone compartmentalize two completely opposing realities so efficiently? How does an individual transition from military commander to serial intruder and then back again before sunrise? Experts who later studied his case would point toward the concept of compartmentalization, the ability to mentally separate conflicting identities without allowing one to contaminate the other. But even understanding the concept does not make it any less disturbing. Imagine returning home after a long day at work. You take off your coat. You prepare dinner. You watch television. Perhaps you answer emails before going to sleep. Now imagine that somewhere else, another person is ending their evening by breaking into strangers' homes and collecting trophies. Then imagine that person waking up the next morning and putting on a decorated military uniform as if nothing happened. The disconnect is almost impossible to process because most human beings rely upon consistency to judge character. We assume good actions indicate good intentions. We assume professional success reflects moral integrity. We assume responsible people behave responsibly everywhere. The Russell Williams case shattered those assumptions. It forced Canadians to confront an uncomfortable reality. Public virtue does not always reveal private truth. In fact, sometimes the two can exist simultaneously for years. The environment around him unintentionally strengthened his invisibility. Military culture values discipline. Communities value trust. Success earns admiration. Admiration reduces suspicion. And reduced suspicion creates freedom for predators who know how to exploit it. Yet there were already warning signs, although nobody could see the complete picture at the time. His criminal behavior was becoming more frequent. His confidence was growing. His methods were evolving. Like many offenders who successfully avoid detection for extended periods, he began developing a dangerous sense of invincibility. Every successful intrusion validated his belief that he could outsmart everyone. Every escape encouraged escalation. Eventually, invading homes would no longer be enough. Obsession itself has momentum. It demands more stimulation over time. The fantasy world must continuously expand in order to satisfy itself. What once felt thrilling eventually feels ordinary. Then new boundaries must be crossed. New risks must be taken. New victims must be chosen. That is the terrifying trajectory hidden beneath this seemingly peaceful setting. Ontario remained beautiful. The communities remained trusting. Military ceremonies continued. Aircraft still took off from CFB Trenton every day. Life appeared unchanged from the outside. Yet beneath that calm surface, a slow-moving disaster was already unfolding. Two worlds existed simultaneously without colliding. One world admired Russell Williams. The other world feared him without even knowing his name. Eventually, those two worlds would crash together in a way nobody could have imagined. And when they did, the shockwaves would travel far beyond a single town, far beyond a single military base, and far beyond the borders of Canada itself. Because this would no longer be just a murder investigation. It would become a terrifying case study about trust, hidden identities, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the most dangerous predators are not hiding at society's edges at all. Sometimes they are standing at its very center. Every true crime story eventually reaches a moment where the focus must shift away from the perpetrator. The headlines often become dominated by the killer's name, the investigation, the courtroom drama, and the shocking details of the crimes. Yet at the heart of every case are real people whose lives existed long before tragedy entered the picture. They had dreams, routines, friendships, fears, favorite songs, unfinished plans, and futures they believed would still be waiting for them tomorrow. In the Russell Williams case, two women would become forever linked to a man they never should have encountered. Their stories deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. Before becoming victims in one of Canada's most notorious criminal investigations, they were daughters, friends, co-workers, and individuals building meaningful lives within their communities. One of those women was Marie-France Comeau. At 37 years old, she was known by many as someone who carried herself with strength and independence. She served in the Canadian military, a profession that demanded commitment, discipline, and resilience. Life in the armed forces is not always glamorous. It often involves long hours, personal sacrifice, and a willingness to place duty above comfort. Those who choose such careers frequently develop a deep sense of responsibility, not only toward their country but toward the people around them. Marie-France was part of that world. She worked within the same military environment that would eventually place her within the orbit of Russell Williams, although there is no indication she ever understood the danger he represented. To most people around her, he was simply another respected officer. That reality makes what happened later even more chilling. The predator and the victim occupied the same professional universe, yet only one of them knew a secret was being kept. Friends and colleagues remembered Marie-France as a person who valued her independence. She had built a life through hard work and determination. Like many adults balancing professional responsibilities, she managed routines that appeared completely ordinary from the outside. She worked. She returned home. She planned for the future. She stayed connected to people she cared about. There was comfort in that normalcy. The small rituals that define everyday existence often go unnoticed until they suddenly disappear. The drive home after work. The television playing softly in the evening. A phone call with a friend. A weekend plan waiting on the calendar. These moments may seem insignificant at the time, yet they collectively form the fabric of a human life. In late 2009, Marie-France was living alone in her home. For many people, living independently represents freedom. It means creating a personal space that belongs entirely to you. The furniture sits exactly where you want it. The routines belong solely to you. The home becomes a sanctuary from the outside world. Unfortunately, predators often see solitude differently. What feels like freedom to one person may appear as vulnerability to another. Investigators would later determine that Russell Williams had been watching her. He was not acting randomly. Like many organized offenders, he relied on observation and patience. He studied routines. He learned patterns. He gathered information. While Marie-France lived her life unaware, someone was quietly transforming ordinary details into opportunities. That realization remains one of the most disturbing elements of stalking-related crimes. The victim continues living normally while the offender gradually builds an invisible map of their existence. Every departure from home, every return, every predictable habit becomes part of a secret file that only the predator can see. Yet Marie-France was not defined by vulnerability. She was a woman who had earned respect through service and commitment. Those who knew her saw someone capable and self-sufficient. The tragedy is not that she lacked strength. The tragedy is that no amount of personal strength can fully protect someone from a predator who carefully plans his attacks while hiding behind a mask of legitimacy. Several months later, another woman would enter this story. Her name was Jessica Lloyd. She was 27 years old and living in Belleville, Ontario. While Marie-France's life had been shaped by military service, Jessica's world reflected a different path. Friends described her as warm, caring, and deeply connected to the people she loved. She was the kind of person whose presence could brighten a room without demanding attention. Some individuals possess an energy that makes others feel comfortable almost immediately. Jessica was often remembered that way. She valued relationships. She enjoyed spending time with family and friends. She had hopes for the future and countless ordinary plans that stretched far beyond the winter of 2010. Looking back through photographs taken before her disappearance, people often notice the same thing. There is a sense of life moving forward. Smiles that suggest optimism. Expressions that reveal someone expecting tomorrow to arrive just like any other day. That is one of the cruelest realities surrounding violent crime. Victims never receive advance warning that their final ordinary day has arrived. On the morning before tragedy strikes, everything still feels normal. There are errands to complete, messages to answer, meals to prepare, future plans to discuss. Life continues according to expectations until suddenly it does not. Jessica's home sat within a community where people generally felt safe. Winter had settled across Ontario. Snow-covered roads and lawns. Trees stood bare against cold skies. At night, neighborhoods became quiet except for the occasional passing vehicle. It was the kind of environment where residents expected peace, not danger. Yet danger often thrives in places where it is least expected. The contrast between appearance and reality would become a recurring theme throughout this case. The neighborhoods looked peaceful. The military commander appeared honorable. The routines seemed ordinary. Beneath each surface, however, something darker was developing. What makes Jessica's story particularly heartbreaking is the future she never had the opportunity to reach. At 27 years old, many chapters of life remained unwritten. Careers evolve. Relationships deepen. Families grow. Dreams change shape as years pass. Human beings naturally imagine themselves moving forward through time. We picture birthdays that have not yet happened. Vacations still waiting to be taken. Conversations we expect to have months from now. Jessica possessed those same expectations. She was planning a future she genuinely believed existed. The people closest to her believed it existed as well. Nobody could have imagined how abruptly everything would change. One of the most important aspects of understanding victims is recognizing that they are never merely names attached to a criminal file. They are entire worlds. Every person influences dozens or even hundreds of other lives. Parents invest years raising children. Friends create memories together. Co-workers share experiences. Romantic partners build emotional connections. When violence removes one individual, the loss spreads outward like ripples across water. The immediate victim suffers first, but grief eventually touches entire networks of people. Families lose daughters. Friends lose confidants. Communities lose familiar faces. Future experiences vanish before they can occur. In the months following the crimes, those left behind would repeatedly confront the same painful question. Why them? It is a question that rarely receives a satisfying answer because predatory violence often follows logic that only exists inside the offender's mind. Victims are selected for reasons that may appear insignificant or completely random to everyone else. A routine. A location. A moment of opportunity. A circumstance beyond anyone's control. The randomness itself becomes part of the horror because it destroys the comforting belief that tragedy only happens to other people. Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd represented different stages of life, different backgrounds, and different personal journeys. Yet both shared one crucial similarity. Neither deserved what happened to them. Neither made choices that invited violence into their lives. Neither knowingly crossed paths with a monster. They were simply living ordinary lives inside communities that believed they were safe. As investigators would later uncover, Russell Williams viewed people through a lens of control and obsession rather than humanity. This distinction matters because it reveals the psychological divide between predator and victim. While Marie-France and Jessica were building futures, maintaining relationships, and experiencing everyday life, Williams was reducing human beings to targets. The more he indulged his fantasies, the less he viewed his victims as individuals. That process of dehumanization allowed his behavior to escalate. It enabled him to separate his actions from the suffering they caused. Yet no amount of psychological distortion can erase reality. Marie-France was a real woman with people who loved her. Jessica was a real woman with dreams still unfolding. Their absence would soon leave holes in the lives of everyone who knew them. Before the investigation, before the media coverage, before the courtroom proceedings, there were simply families expecting ordinary tomorrows. Parents who anticipated future phone calls. Friends who assumed there would be more shared experiences. Co-workers who expected another day at work. None of them knew they were approaching a moment that would permanently divide life into two chapters, before and after. Before the phone call. Before the missing person report. Before the devastating confirmation that something terrible had happened. The tragedy had not yet revealed itself fully. The communities around them still moved through daily routines. Snow continued falling across Ontario. Cars continued traveling familiar roads. People continued believing they understood the world around them. But beneath that surface, events were already moving toward a collision that would forever alter countless lives. And when that collision arrived, the stories of Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd would become central to understanding not only the crimes themselves, but the devastating human cost hidden behind every headline that followed. There are moments in certain criminal cases where the line separating normal life from irreversible tragedy is astonishingly thin. A few minutes earlier, someone is preparing dinner, checking messages, or getting ready for bed. A few minutes later, an entire future has been erased. In the Russell Williams case, that line would be crossed twice in ways that exposed not only the brutality of the crimes but also the frightening patience of the man responsible. By late 2009, Russell Williams was no longer operating as a simple intruder who broke into homes for the thrill of violating privacy. The behavior that had once existed as a hidden obsession had evolved into something far more dangerous. For years, he had trained himself to observe without being seen. He had conditioned himself to take risks while avoiding consequences. Every successful crime had strengthened a dangerous belief inside his mind that he was untouchable. The fantasy world he had built was no longer enough. The boundaries he once respected had disappeared entirely. He had reached a stage that investigators often describe as escalation, the moment when the offender's desires become increasingly extreme because previous actions no longer provide the same psychological reward. One winter night in November 2009, Marie-France Comeau unknowingly entered the final hours of her life. The world around her appeared completely ordinary. Temperatures had dropped as another cold Canadian evening settled over Ontario. Houses glowed warmly from the inside while darkness consumed everything beyond the windows. The familiar routines of the day were ending. People were returning home from work. Television screens flickered behind curtains. Roads gradually emptied as communities prepared for sleep. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing announced that danger was approaching. Marie-France was in the place where she should have felt safest, her own home. The very concept of home carries a powerful emotional meaning. It is where people lower their guard. It is where vulnerability becomes acceptable. Human beings are not designed to remain alert every second of every day. Eventually, everyone seeks refuge somewhere. Unfortunately, Russell Williams understood this psychological truth better than most predators. He did not target chaos. He targeted comfort. He understood that the greatest advantage a predator can have is surprise. Investigators would later determine that he had already been studying her routines. This was not spontaneous violence. It was deliberate and calculated. He knew aspects of her schedule. He knew she lived alone. He knew precisely when opportunity would present itself. Somewhere during that evening, while Marie-France believed she was simply ending another ordinary day, someone else had already transformed her life into part of a plan. One of the most unsettling realities surrounding organized offenders is their ability to separate preparation from emotion. While victims continue living in the present, offenders may already be mentally operating several steps ahead. They are thinking about timing, movement, entrances, exits, and contingencies. Their emotions become secondary to control itself. Control becomes the objective. As darkness deepened, Russell Williams entered her home. What happened next would forever alter the lives of everyone connected to her. The attack was violent and intentional. Marie-France was overpowered inside a place that should have protected her. Her life was taken by someone she likely never imagined could represent danger. The sheer betrayal embedded within that fact is impossible to ignore. The commander of a military base, a man trusted by an entire institution, had crossed every conceivable moral boundary. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect came afterward. Rather than panicking or collapsing under the weight of what he had done, he calmly returned to his public life. There was no dramatic unraveling. No obvious outward sign that anything had changed. In the days that followed, he continued moving through society exactly as before. He attended meetings. He interacted with colleagues. He maintained the image that had protected him for years. Then he did something investigators and psychologists would later highlight as particularly chilling. He sent condolences to those mourning Marie-France. It was an act of deception that demonstrated the extraordinary lengths he was willing to go in order to preserve his mask. Imagine grieving the loss of someone you loved while unknowingly receiving sympathy from the person responsible. It is a level of manipulation that feels almost impossible to comprehend. Yet that was precisely the world Russell Williams had created for himself. He was not merely hiding his crimes. He was actively participating in the aftermath as though he were an innocent observer. As horrifying as the murder of Marie-France was, it did not stop him. That is often the tragedy of escalating criminal behavior. Success encourages repetition. The absence of consequences feeds confidence. Confidence evolves into arrogance. Months passed, but internally, the dangerous machinery inside his mind continued turning. By January 2010, another woman had entered his orbit. Jessica Lloyd was 27 years old and living her own ordinary life in Belleville, Ontario. Winter had fully settled over the region. Snow-covered yards and sidewalks. The air itself seemed quieter during nighttime hours. The world appeared peaceful from the outside. But once again, appearance and reality were moving in opposite directions. Like many offenders who rely heavily upon planning, Williams did not choose victims impulsively. Observation remained central to his method. He monitored routines. He paid attention to schedules. He waited patiently. Predators who thrive for extended periods often possess an uncomfortable advantage over their victims: patience. They are willing to wait days, weeks, or even months if it increases the likelihood of success. Eventually, opportunity presented itself. On January 28, 2010, Jessica disappeared from her home. For families, there is a uniquely terrifying period during every missing person case. It is the stage where uncertainty dominates every thought. Phones ring constantly. Friends contact one another searching for answers. People begin replaying recent conversations in their minds. Did she mention any plans? Was she meeting someone? Did anything seem unusual? At first, hope competes against fear. Human beings naturally want to believe there is an innocent explanation. Maybe she simply forgot to call. Maybe her phone battery died. Maybe she is delayed somewhere unexpectedly. But as hours pass, those hopeful possibilities begin collapsing under the weight of reality. Jessica was not the type of person to simply disappear. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Unknown to those desperately searching for her, she had already fallen into the hands of one of the country's most dangerous hidden predators. What happened during her captivity would later reveal the extent of Russell Williams' obsession with control. Authorities eventually discovered evidence indicating that he documented his actions extensively, turning real human suffering into material for his own distorted fantasies. This behavior reflected years of escalation. His crimes were no longer centered on secrecy alone. They had become performances for himself, rituals designed to reinforce power and domination. Yet behind every criminal ritual exists a devastating human cost. Jessica was not an object. She was not a fantasy. She was a living person with a family waiting for her return. Every minute that passed increased the suffering of everyone who loved her. Meanwhile, Russell Williams continued functioning within two separate worlds. That contradiction remains astonishing even years later. Somewhere, investigators were beginning to mobilize resources. Families were worrying. Communities were becoming anxious. Yet he still possessed the ability to step back into his public identity as though nothing had happened. The compartmentalization was extraordinary and deeply unsettling. Experts often debate whether certain offenders possess an enhanced ability to emotionally disconnect from their actions. In Russell Williams' case, the evidence strongly suggested he had become remarkably skilled at separating his crimes from his professional identity. But emotional detachment does not eliminate reality. Every action leaves traces behind. Every crime introduces variables that cannot be controlled forever. Every escalation increases the likelihood of mistakes. And mistakes were slowly accumulating around him. While he believed himself to be orchestrating perfect crimes, a hidden clock had already started counting down toward his downfall. Looking back, it becomes easier to see the pattern. Each crime became bolder than the last. Each risk became larger. Each success convinced him he remained invisible. Unfortunately for him, no human being is invisible forever. The same arrogance that fuels escalation often plants the seeds of eventual capture. Yet during those terrible days in early 2010, nobody knew that answer was coming. Instead, communities across Ontario were experiencing something else entirely: fear. Fear spread quietly at first. People began locking doors earlier than usual. Families checked on loved ones more frequently. Women living alone suddenly found themselves examining windows and entrances before bedtime. The invisible sense of safety that communities depend upon had begun to crack. There is a profound psychological impact that occurs when crimes invade private homes. Public spaces already carry understood risks. But homes represent security itself. When violence enters those spaces, trust erodes everywhere. Suddenly every unfamiliar vehicle feels suspicious. Every unexplained sound becomes alarming. Every shadow outside a window appears threatening. The murders did not only affect the immediate victims. They altered the emotional landscape of entire communities. Yet perhaps nobody felt more confident than Russell Williams himself. He had successfully maintained his disguise for years. He had cultivated immense respect. He had risen to one of the highest positions in the Canadian military. He had deceived everyone around him. Or at least, that is what he believed. But somewhere beneath the snow-covering Ontario roads, hidden in tiny details he barely noticed, evidence was already waiting. The crimes themselves were over. The next chapter was beginning. And unlike previous times, this chapter would no longer belong to him. It would belong to investigators who refused to stop searching, to grieving families demanding answers, and to a series of clues that would eventually dismantle the carefully constructed life he had spent years protecting. The morning after a crime often carries a strange contradiction. The world continues moving exactly as it always has, yet for a handful of people, reality has permanently changed. Traffic lights still switch from red to green. Cafes still open their doors. Parents still drive their children to school. But somewhere inside police stations, family homes, and quiet neighborhoods, a different clock begins ticking. It is a clock measured not by minutes but by uncertainty, fear, and urgency. By early 2010, that clock was moving rapidly across Ontario. Jessica Lloyd was gone, and nobody could explain why. Her disappearance immediately created a sense of alarm that spread far beyond her immediate circle. Unlike fictional mysteries that unfold dramatically in a matter of hours, real investigations often begin with fragments. Tiny pieces of information. Small observations. Details that seem insignificant on their own but may later become essential. Detectives understand this reality very well. In the early stages of every missing persons case, nothing can be ignored because the difference between solving a crime and losing valuable time often comes down to a single overlooked detail. When investigators arrived at Jessica's home in Belleville, they entered an environment that immediately felt unusual. The house itself was not chaotic. There were no signs of an impulsive robbery. Everyday objects remained where they belonged. Furniture stood untouched. Familiar possessions still occupied their ordinary places. Yet something was undeniably wrong. Jessica's life appeared to have stopped abruptly in the middle of its natural progression. Investigators often describe these scenes as emotional contradictions. A person's presence still exists everywhere, yet the person themselves is gone. A jacket may hang by the entrance. A cup may remain in the kitchen. Everyday objects suddenly transform into reminders that someone expected to continue living their normal life. Detectives carefully documented every room, every surface, and every possible point of entry. They moved slowly because haste can destroy evidence forever. Every footprint mattered. Every fiber mattered. Every fingerprint carried potential significance. Outside, Ontario's winter landscape presented both an obstacle and an opportunity. Snow has a unique relationship with criminal investigations. On one hand, it can erase details as weather conditions change. On the other hand, it has the remarkable ability to preserve movement. Snow remembers what people often forget. It remembers footsteps. It remembers tire tracks. It remembers disturbances that would otherwise disappear on dry pavement. Somewhere near Jessica's home, investigators noticed something that immediately captured their attention. Tire impressions had been left behind. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Thousands of vehicles traveled through Ontario every day. Countless tire tracks existed everywhere. But experienced investigators understand a crucial principle. Ordinary things become extraordinary when they appear in the wrong place at the wrong time. The detectives documented everything carefully. Measurements were taken. Photographs were captured. Patterns were recorded. At that moment, nobody knew these tire tracks would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. But detectives had learned long ago never to dismiss details simply because they appeared mundane. While forensic teams worked at the scene, another investigation was unfolding elsewhere. Jessica's family and friends were desperately searching for answers. Phones rang continuously. People retraced her recent movements. Conversations from previous days suddenly became significant. Human memory works in a peculiar way during crises. Ordinary moments that once felt forgettable are suddenly examined under a microscope. What exactly did she say during her last conversation? Did she mention seeing anyone unusual? Did anything seem out of place? Family members often experience a painful mixture of hope and dread during these moments. Hope insists there must be an explanation. Dread quietly whispers another possibility. Every hour that passed intensified those emotions. Meanwhile, investigators expanded their efforts. Missing person cases demand urgency because time itself becomes evidence. Surveillance footage was examined. Potential witnesses were contacted. Officers traveled throughout neighborhoods speaking with residents. Some people remembered nothing unusual. Others recalled seeing vehicles but could not identify them clearly. Information began flowing into command centers in enormous quantities. The challenge was not obtaining data. The challenge was separating meaningful clues from background noise. Every major investigation produces an avalanche of information. Thousands of details emerge simultaneously, and investigators must determine which ones truly matter. As police focused their attention on Jessica's disappearance, another unsettling realization began forming in the background. There were similarities between this case and previous incidents. Patterns slowly started emerging. Certain details connected to earlier crimes suddenly looked more significant than they had before. Detectives understood something important was happening, although they still lacked a complete picture. What they did not yet realize was the sheer scale of the hidden world they were about to uncover. One of the strengths of experienced investigators lies in their ability to recognize patterns that ordinary people might overlook. Criminal behavior, especially organized criminal behavior, often follows routines. Offenders believe they are improvising, but over time they develop habits. They prefer certain methods. They return to familiar approaches. Their personalities begin revealing themselves through repeated actions. Every crime scene tells a story, but that story rarely arrives in chronological order. Investigators must assemble it piece by piece. Somewhere inside police headquarters, maps began filling with notes and timelines. Whiteboards displayed names, locations, and unanswered questions. Detectives worked long hours fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and a growing determination to stop whoever was responsible. Yet the suspect remained hidden behind one of the strongest shields imaginable, his own reputation. Nobody was looking toward one of Canada's most respected military commanders. Nobody was imagining that a senior officer entrusted with enormous responsibility could be connected to these crimes. In many ways, his professional status acted as camouflage. Human beings naturally build assumptions about character. We tend to associate uniforms with honor. We associate rank with discipline. We associate achievement with trustworthiness. Predators who successfully hide for years often understand this psychological bias extremely well. Russell Williams had spent decades constructing a public identity so powerful that it discouraged suspicion automatically. Yet evidence does not care about social status. Evidence does not salute rank. Evidence does not recognize titles or awards. Evidence simply exists, waiting to be discovered. And that discovery process was accelerating rapidly. The tire tracks remained at the center of investigators' attention. Specialists began comparing patterns and narrowing possibilities. Modern investigative work frequently depends upon seemingly small physical details that can eliminate thousands of potential suspects. Tire impressions contain characteristics that many people never think about. Different manufacturers create unique tread patterns. Wear and tear develop distinct signatures over time. Even ordinary usage leaves identifiable marks. Investigators understood they were not searching for every vehicle in Ontario. They were searching for one specific vehicle that had been present at one specific place during one specific period. It was a daunting task, but not an impossible one. Elsewhere, communities throughout Ontario were changing emotionally. Fear had become visible. People started checking locks twice before bedtime. Outdoor lights remained on throughout the night. Neighbors communicated more frequently. Conversations that once centered around weather or work now revolved around safety. Every unknown car suddenly attracted attention. Every unusual movement generated concern. This invisible shift often accompanies high-profile crimes. Safety itself begins to feel fragile. The emotional atmosphere surrounding entire neighborhoods transforms almost overnight. Yet perhaps the greatest irony was that Russell Williams remained immersed in his ordinary life while all of this unfolded around him. He continued attending professional engagements. He maintained routines. He interacted with people who trusted him completely. If someone had passed him in a hallway during those days, they would have seen nothing unusual. No panic. No visible anxiety. No obvious signs of collapse. But beneath that calm exterior, pressure was slowly building. Every expanding investigation narrows possibilities. Every new piece of evidence reduces available space for deception. The walls were beginning to close around him, although he could not fully see it yet. Detectives, however, were becoming increasingly confident that their answer existed somewhere within the evidence they had already collected. The challenge was connecting the final pieces together. Looking back years later, many investigators would describe this phase as one of the most important moments in the entire case. Not because they already knew the identity of the offender, but because they trusted the process. True investigations are rarely solved by sudden inspiration. They are solved through persistence, through patience, through an unwavering commitment to details that other people might dismiss. Somewhere inside those tire tracks hidden in the snow lay the beginning of the end for Russell Williams. He simply did not know it yet. For years, he had mastered the art of hiding in plain sight. He had built walls made from reputation, discipline, and trust. But one undeniable truth exists in every criminal investigation. The larger the deception, the more fragile it eventually becomes. And now, for the first time in years, that deception had begun to crack. Every major investigation eventually enters its most frustrating phase. The excitement of discovering initial clues begins to fade, and investigators find themselves standing in a maze of possibilities. Hundreds of names appear. Dozens of theories emerge. Every new lead creates hope, only to collapse under scrutiny hours later. This is the stage where patience becomes more important than instinct. It is also the stage where many dangerous offenders believe they are safest. By early February 2010, authorities in Ontario had assembled enormous amounts of information surrounding Jessica Lloyd's disappearance. Detectives worked in shifts that stretched late into the night. Coffee cups accumulated on desks beside stacks of reports and photographs. Whiteboards filled with timelines, arrows, and handwritten notes connecting places, dates, and unanswered questions. Every available resource was being mobilized because investigators understood something very important. This was no longer an isolated incident. Somewhere within the evidence existed a person capable of calculated violence, someone who had likely committed other crimes and might strike again if left unidentified. Fear had spread across Belleville and neighboring communities. The fear was subtle at first, but now it had become visible. Hardware stores reported increased purchases of locks and security equipment. Families reminded one another to check windows before going to bed. Women living alone began altering routines they had followed for years. People who had never before considered themselves vulnerable suddenly became hyper-aware of their surroundings. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to adapt to danger, even when danger remains invisible. But that adaptation comes at a cost. Trust begins to erode. Comfort disappears. Ordinary life starts feeling unfamiliar. Meanwhile, inside police headquarters, investigators wrestled with dozens of possible scenarios. Had Jessica been targeted by someone she knew personally? Had she crossed paths with a stranger? Was there a connection to previous crimes that authorities had yet to identify? Every hypothesis demanded investigation because assumptions can destroy cases. Experienced detectives understand that certainty is dangerous during early stages. The evidence must lead the investigation, not personal opinions. Officers revisited neighborhoods repeatedly. They knocked on doors, re-interviewed witnesses, and compared timelines. One person remembered a vehicle but could not identify its make. Another thought they had seen unusual movement several days earlier. Others remembered nothing at all. Such inconsistencies are common. Human memory is imperfect, especially when people are asked to recall seemingly insignificant details after the fact. Investigators had to separate useful information from background noise, a process that often requires extraordinary patience. During these long hours, another reality was unfolding just a few miles away. Russell Williams continued living as though nothing extraordinary was happening. He woke up, dressed professionally, attended military responsibilities, and interacted with colleagues exactly as he always had. This remains one of the most difficult aspects of the case for many people to understand. How could a person move so effortlessly between two opposing worlds? How could someone carry the burden of horrific secrets while appearing completely composed? The answer may lie in one of the defining traits of organized offenders. They create compartments inside their minds. They separate identities so effectively that one version of themselves barely interferes with the other. To co-workers, Russell Williams was Commander Williams. To investigators, though they did not know it yet, he was becoming something else entirely. Every day he remained unidentified strengthened his confidence. Years of successful deception had conditioned him to believe he was smarter than everyone around him. That belief is often one of the most dangerous turning points in a criminal's psychological development. Confidence becomes arrogance. Arrogance becomes carelessness. And carelessness eventually leaves evidence behind. Investigators were beginning to notice patterns that pointed toward a highly organized individual. Whoever was responsible appeared methodical. The offender understood timing and risk management. There was evidence of surveillance behavior, suggesting someone who carefully studied victims before acting. This was not random violence driven by impulsive anger. It reflected planning, patience, and discipline. Those characteristics led investigators toward certain offender profiles. They began considering possibilities involving someone with structured training, perhaps a person accustomed to order and organization. Yet even then, the thought of a senior military commander remained almost unimaginable. This is one of the reasons why predators who occupy respected positions can remain hidden for so long. Human beings instinctively protect their assumptions. We resist information that challenges our understanding of reality. The idea that an accomplished military leader could simultaneously be a dangerous predator felt almost absurd. But evidence does not operate according to social expectations. It simply accumulates. And it was accumulating quickly. As investigators expanded their analysis, they began revisiting earlier crimes throughout Ontario. Reports that once seemed disconnected suddenly appeared related. A pattern emerged involving residential break-ins targeting women. Personal items had disappeared from homes over a period of years. These were not traditional burglaries motivated by money. Expensive electronics had often been ignored. Valuable possessions remained untouched. Instead, intimate personal belongings had been taken. The pattern was unusual enough to attract attention. Detectives started wondering if the offender responsible for these invasions could be linked to the more recent violence. Piece by piece, separate incidents began forming a larger picture. The realization itself was disturbing. 4 years, someone had been operating quietly throughout these communities without detection. Every successful intrusion represented another missed opportunity to stop escalation before tragedy occurred. Yet hindsight often creates illusions of simplicity. Looking backward, patterns appear obvious. In real time, however, investigators must navigate uncertainty every step of the way. The challenge was enormous. Thousands of individuals lived within the affected regions. Thousands of vehicles traveled those roads every day. Thousands of possibilities existed. But detectives remained focused on one essential principle. Organized offenders leave organized evidence. If the perpetrator was truly as methodical as he appeared, then his habits would eventually expose him. That belief kept the investigation moving forward. Elsewhere, inside communities surrounding CFB Trenton, life continued normally. Military personnel carried out their duties. Aircraft departed according to schedule. Meetings proceeded without interruption. People exchanged greetings in hallways and parking lots. Nobody looked twice at Russell Williams because they had no reason to. In many ways, his greatest weapon had never been physical strength. It had been perception. He understood how society categorizes people. We place individuals into mental boxes based on profession, appearance, and status. Decorated military commander. Trusted leader. Public servant. Once those labels become attached to a person, removing them requires overwhelming evidence. Yet overwhelming evidence was gradually forming beneath the surface. Investigators simply had not assembled all of it yet. The emotional toll on detectives also began increasing. Cases involving vulnerable victims often affect investigators deeply because they understand the stakes involved. Every unsolved day represented another day the offender remained free. Every delay carried potential consequences. Officers missed meals, sacrificed sleep, and spent countless hours examining information that many people would find unbearable. Crime scene photographs, timelines, forensic reports, and witness statements became their world. Their mission was singular. Identify the offender before he had another opportunity to act. As pressure intensified externally, pressure also began growing internally for Russell Williams, although it may not have been visible to anyone around him. Maintaining dual identities for years requires extraordinary mental energy. Every lie must be remembered. Every inconsistency must be managed. Every interaction carries potential risk. The larger the investigation became, the more variables entered his world. Predators often fear unpredictability because unpredictability cannot be controlled. And for someone obsessed with control, losing control can be psychologically devastating. There is another aspect of this phase that makes the case particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective. Russell Williams had spent years mastering environments built on order and structure. Military operations depend on predictability. Planning reduces uncertainty. Yet criminal investigations are designed to create uncertainty. Detectives intentionally disrupt patterns. They gather information quietly. They move unpredictably. They force offenders into defensive positions. Without realizing it, Williams was slowly being pushed into unfamiliar territory. For the first time in years, he was no longer the only person studying behavior. Investigators were studying him too, even if they had not yet identified him by name. Looking back, one can almost imagine two invisible lines moving toward one another. On one side stood detectives assembling evidence piece by piece. On the other stood a man convinced he had perfected deception itself. Neither side had fully collided yet, but the distance between them was shrinking rapidly. Every passing hour reduced that distance further. Every new analysis narrowed possibilities. Every careful examination of evidence brought investigators one step closer to the truth. Somewhere within those countless documents and observations existed a simple answer hidden behind layers of prestige and reputation. Soon, those layers would begin to disappear. Soon, one of the most shocking revelations in Canadian criminal history would emerge. And when it did, the greatest obstacle investigators had faced all along would become painfully obvious. The monster they were hunting had never been hiding in the shadows. He had been standing in plain sight, surrounded by admiration the entire time. Every investigation has a moment that detectives often remember for the rest of their lives. It is not always dramatic. There are no explosions, no sudden confessions, and no cinematic revelations accompanied by dramatic music. Sometimes it is a tiny detail sitting quietly in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to recognize its importance. In the Russell Williams case, that moment arrived through something deceptively simple. Tire tracks pressed into snow. For years, Russell Williams had trusted complexity. He trusted his planning, his discipline, his routines, and his ability to manage countless details simultaneously. Ironically, his downfall would begin with something incredibly ordinary. A vehicle had to travel somewhere. Tires had to touch the ground. Snow had to record that movement. It was a reminder of one of the oldest truths in criminal investigations. No matter how intelligent an offender believes himself to be, reality always leaves traces behind. By early February 2010, investigators had intensified their efforts dramatically. The disappearance and murder of Jessica Lloyd had transformed into one of the most urgent investigations in Ontario. Specialized teams were comparing evidence relentlessly. Detectives moved through information with extraordinary precision because they knew time mattered. The tire impressions discovered near Jessica's home remained central to their analysis. Experts began examining tread patterns, dimensions, and unique characteristics. Slowly, possibilities narrowed. Every elimination brought them closer to one answer. Somewhere in Ontario existed a vehicle that perfectly matched the evidence they were holding in their hands. Investigators expanded their search radius. They reviewed records and looked at individuals connected to the surrounding areas. Their work was methodical rather than impulsive. This was not guesswork. It was evidence guiding every decision. Eventually, their attention landed on a vehicle that fit remarkably well. A Nissan Pathfinder. On paper, it was simply another SUV among thousands of similar vehicles across Canada. But detectives do not stop at surface appearances. They compare details. They measure patterns. They search for certainty rather than coincidence. The more investigators examined the vehicle, the more uncomfortable the situation became. Because the vehicle did not belong to an ordinary suspect. It belonged to Colonel Russell Williams, commander of CFB Trenton. Even saying the possibility out loud must have felt surreal at first. Human beings are naturally resistant to information that contradicts deeply rooted assumptions. Decorated military commander. Trusted leader. National figure. The image was so powerful that it almost acted as a psychological barrier. Yet evidence was slowly dismantling that barrier piece by piece. Detectives understood they could not afford emotional hesitation. Reputation meant nothing if physical evidence pointed elsewhere. The investigation entered a new phase immediately. Every step from that moment forward required extraordinary care. High-profile suspects present unique challenges. One mistake can compromise entire cases. One leak can destroy months of work. Investigators had to remain disciplined and discreet. As they gathered additional evidence, a disturbing pattern became impossible to ignore. The connections were growing stronger. Too strong to dismiss as coincidence. Russell Williams was no longer existing outside the investigation. He was moving toward its center. Then came February 7, 2010. A date that would permanently alter Canadian criminal history. Williams was asked to come in for questioning. There was nothing outwardly dramatic about the invitation itself. In many ways, it looked ordinary. A professional man arriving for a conversation with investigators. But beneath that calm surface, years of deception were about to collide with reality. The interrogation room itself was almost painfully ordinary. Plain walls. Simple furniture. Bright lighting that exposed every subtle movement. There is something psychologically significant about these rooms. They strip away status. Uniforms lose their power there. Titles disappear. Prestige becomes meaningless. Everyone is reduced to one thing, a human being facing facts. Russell Williams entered that room carrying years of confidence with him. For decades, he had controlled environments. He had supervised operations, led personnel, and navigated high-pressure situations professionally. Perhaps he believed this would be another challenge he could manage. Perhaps he still trusted his own ability to manipulate perception. But this time was different. Sitting across from him was Ontario Provincial Police investigator Jim Smith, a man whose calm demeanor would later become famous around the world. What made Smith extraordinary was not aggression. It was patience. He did not shout. He did not pound tables. He did not attempt intimidation. Instead, he did something much more powerful. He removed escape routes one by one. Great interrogators understand an important psychological principle. Human beings collapse more effectively under certainty than under force. When undeniable evidence accumulates gradually, resistance becomes exhausting. The suspect is forced to confront reality without dramatic confrontation. That was precisely what happened inside this room. At first, Russell Williams remained composed. His posture reflected confidence. His responses were controlled. Years of professional experience had taught him how to regulate his emotions in stressful environments. But Jim Smith understood that emotional walls rarely collapse all at once. They fracture slowly. Every piece of evidence became another crack. Investigators introduced information carefully and deliberately. The tire evidence emerged as one of the key components. It was tangible, objective, difficult to explain away. Then came additional facts, more details, more connections. The conversation remained calm throughout, but psychologically, something profound was happening. For perhaps the first time in years, Russell Williams was losing control. Control had always been central to his identity. Control over his public image. Control over victims. Control over routines. Control over risk. Suddenly, control was gone. The room itself began transforming before viewers' eyes, something millions of people would later witness when footage of the interrogation became publicly available. Tiny changes appeared first. His eyes moved differently. His body language shifted. His confidence became less certain. People often imagine guilt appearing dramatically, but reality is much subtler. It arrives through hesitation, silence, and surrender. The performance requires enormous energy to maintain, and eventually that energy runs out. Jim Smith never rushed the process. He remained patient because he knew the evidence was already doing the work for him. Every answer Russell Williams offered had fewer places to hide. Every denial became increasingly difficult to sustain. Then came the moment many investigators later described as extraordinary. The mask began falling away. Not physically, but psychologically. For years, two versions of Russell Williams had existed simultaneously. The decorated commander and the hidden predator. Inside that interrogation room, those identities collided. There was nowhere left to separate them. The walls he had constructed over years were collapsing in real time. Eventually, he confessed. Years of hidden crimes suddenly surfaced all at once. Not just the murders, the burglaries, the invasions, the obsessive behavior, the collections of stolen personal items, the carefully documented secret world he had created. The scale of the deception shocked even experienced investigators. Authorities would eventually uncover an enormous archive exposing the extent of his activities. Thousands of photographs, extensive documentation, evidence revealing years of escalating criminal behavior. The discovery transformed public shock into disbelief. The truth was even darker than many people had imagined. Across Canada, news spread rapidly. Citizens struggled to process what they were hearing. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Newspapers rushed to update headlines. The commander, trusted with immense responsibility, had become one of the country's most notorious offenders. The emotional reaction throughout the nation was immediate. Anger mixed with confusion. Confusion mixed with betrayal. Many people found themselves asking the same question repeatedly. How was this possible? How could nobody know? The answer, unfortunately, is uncomfortable. Predators often succeed because society depends on trust. We cannot function while suspecting everyone around us. Communities are built upon assumptions of safety and cooperation. Most people deserve that trust. But a small number of individuals learn how to weaponize it. Russell Williams had weaponized trust for years. Yet in the end, it was not his intelligence that defined the story. It was his arrogance. He believed he could continue forever. He believed his reputation would protect him indefinitely. He believed planning alone could overcome reality. He was wrong. Because reality is persistent. Snow preserved evidence. Investigators remained patient. A single conversation inside a plain interrogation room dismantled an empire of lies built over decades. By the time February 7th ended, one chapter of fear was closing. The mystery was over. The predator had been identified. But another chapter was about to begin. One that would force victims' families, communities, and an entire country to confront the full weight of everything he had done. The world now knew his name, but far more importantly, the world finally knew the truth hiding behind it. The moment a confession is secured, many people imagine the story is over. In reality, an entirely different battle begins. Investigators may know the truth, but truth alone is not enough. It must be documented, organized, presented, and transformed into justice inside a courtroom. The legal process is often less dramatic than movies portray, yet in cases like Russell Williams, its emotional impact can be overwhelming. Because now the nation was no longer dealing with a mystery. Canada was confronting the reality of betrayal on a massive scale. In the days following his arrest and confession, authorities began revealing the extraordinary scale of what investigators had discovered. Every new announcement seemed more disturbing than the one before it. The public learned that this was not a man who had suddenly snapped. This was someone who had spent years cultivating a hidden world. Years of planning. Years of deception. Years of violating lives while maintaining an image of honor and professionalism. Search warrants executed at his residence exposed a secret universe that had existed behind closed doors for a long time. Investigators uncovered thousands of images and extensive documentation connected to his criminal activities. Every discovery reinforced a horrifying reality. This was not chaotic behavior. It was organized, deliberate, and methodical. The contrast between his public achievements and his private actions became almost impossible for people to comprehend. Across Canada, citizens struggled with conflicting emotions. Anger was obvious, but something deeper also emerged. Betrayal. There is a special kind of betrayal that occurs when criminals occupy positions of trust. Society grants certain professions an enormous amount of confidence because communities depend upon those institutions functioning properly. Military officers are often viewed as symbols of sacrifice, discipline, and service. Russell Williams had not simply violated individual victims. In the eyes of many Canadians, he had violated the trust associated with the uniform itself. News broadcasts replayed his photographs repeatedly. One image in military attire contrasted sharply with the horrifying details now emerging publicly. People stared at his face, searching for signs they might have missed. Some expected to see evil reflected in his expression. Others expected to find clues hidden somewhere in his eyes. But that is one of the most uncomfortable truths about cases like this. Monsters do not always look monstrous. Sometimes they look exactly like everyone else. As prosecutors assembled the case, victims' families were entering another painful chapter. The arrest brought relief, but relief does not erase grief. Closure is a word often used after major criminal cases, yet many families later explain that closure does not truly exist. There is no magical moment where pain disappears. There is only movement forward. Slow, uneven, and incomplete movement. For the loved ones of Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd, life had already been permanently divided into before and after. Justice could punish the offender, but it could never restore what had been taken. As preparations for court proceedings continued, the overwhelming evidence changed the trajectory of the case significantly. Prosecutors possessed extensive documentation, physical evidence, and a confession. The strength of the evidence left little room for prolonged legal battles. Russell Williams eventually pleaded guilty to 88 charges. The number itself stunned many people. 88 separate offenses. 2 counts of first-degree murder. Sexual assaults. Forcible confinement. Dozens upon dozens of residential break-ins that had stretched across years. Hearing those charges listed together transformed public understanding of the case. This was not a series of isolated mistakes. It was a hidden criminal career operating beneath the surface of an otherwise celebrated life. Courtrooms possess a unique atmosphere during high-profile cases. They are simultaneously quiet and emotionally overwhelming. The rooms themselves often appear ordinary. Wooden benches. Fluorescent lights. Legal documents stacked neatly across tables. Yet within those walls, lives are forever redefined. Families sit carrying unimaginable grief. Reporters fill designated areas taking notes rapidly. Lawyers organize arguments carefully. And at the center of everything sits a person whose actions have changed countless futures. When Russell Williams appeared in court, the image was dramatically different from the one Canadians had known for years. Gone was the commanding military leader who had stood confidently before cameras and personnel. Gone was the authority associated with rank and title. Instead, there was a defendant confronting the consequences of his actions. There is something profoundly symbolic about courtrooms because they neutralize status. The law does not recognize prestige as a shield against accountability. Whether someone is wealthy or poor, famous or unknown, highly respected or entirely forgotten, they sit before the same system once sufficient evidence exists. During proceedings, details emerged that further exposed the disturbing depth of his double life. Investigators described years of escalating criminal behavior. They outlined how his offenses had evolved over time. Psychological experts and legal analysts would later examine the case extensively because it represented such an extreme example of compartmentalization. How had he managed two identities so effectively for so long? There is no simple answer. Human beings are incredibly complex. Some individuals become remarkably skilled at separating their impulses from their public personas. Yet no matter how sophisticated those internal divisions become, reality eventually forces them to collide. That collision was happening now in full view of an entire nation. Throughout the proceedings, attention repeatedly returned to the victims. Their names mattered more than his rank. Their stories mattered more than his accomplishments. That distinction became critically important because true justice is not merely about condemning offenders. It is about recognizing the humanity of those who suffered. Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd were remembered not as headlines but as people whose lives had value independent of tragedy. Family members carried extraordinary emotional burdens into these proceedings. Every hearing required them to revisit painful realities. Every discussion reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. Yet many families choose to attend because witnessing accountability firsthand carries its own significance. It is a way of reclaiming a small amount of control from events that once felt entirely uncontrollable. October 22, 2010, finally arrived. The date represented one of the final major chapters in the legal process. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with expectation. Reporters prepared to document every detail. Legal teams organized paperwork. Family members braced themselves emotionally. And then the sentence came. 2 concurrent life sentences. No eligibility for parole for 25 years. In addition to imprisonment, he would be stripped of his military rank and honors. The symbolism behind that decision resonated deeply throughout Canada. His achievements had once elevated him to one of the country's most respected positions. Now those honors were being removed because they no longer represented service. They represented betrayal. For many Canadians, this aspect of the sentence carried enormous meaning. Institutions survive on trust. When individuals abuse that trust, institutions must respond decisively to preserve public confidence. Yet despite the sentence, despite the guilty pleas, despite the overwhelming evidence, certain questions remained unanswered. Questions that often accompany cases involving hidden predators. What exactly was happening inside his mind? When did the line first begin to blur between fantasy and action? Could anyone have recognized warning signs earlier? These questions continue to generate discussion among psychologists, criminologists, and investigators even today. There may never be perfect answers. Human behavior is rarely simple enough to fit inside neat explanations. But one conclusion became unavoidable. Russell Williams was not a spontaneous offender. He was an offender whose crimes escalated over years because he repeatedly succeeded without consequences. The case became a powerful reminder of why early intervention matters, why smaller crimes cannot always be dismissed, and why patterns of obsessive behavior deserve serious attention before they grow into something catastrophic. As court proceedings ended, a sense of finality settled across Canada, but it was not celebration. Nobody celebrates outcomes like these. Instead, there was quiet relief. Relief that he could no longer hurt anyone. Relief that communities no longer had to live beneath invisible fear. Relief that families at least had answers, painful though those answers might be. Somewhere beyond the cameras and newspaper headlines, ordinary life slowly began returning. Streets once again became familiar. People gradually resumed routines. Communities started rebuilding their sense of safety. But certain scars remained permanent because some stories leave marks that never completely disappear. The image of a decorated commander sitting inside a courtroom as a convicted serial offender would forever become one of the most shocking transformations in Canadian criminal history. And yet, perhaps the most important lesson had nothing to do with him at all. It had everything to do with vigilance, accountability, and remembering the people whose lives were stolen long before the world ever knew his name. Some stories refuse to end when the courtroom lights turn off. The legal system can deliver a sentence, prison doors can close behind a convicted murderer, and headlines can slowly disappear from television screens, but certain cases continue to live inside the collective memory of a nation for years, even decades. The Russell Williams case is one of those stories. It is no longer simply a true crime case in Canada. It has become a lesson, a warning, and a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about human nature itself. Today, Russell Williams remains incarcerated at Port Cartier Institution, a maximum security prison located far away from the communities whose lives he shattered. The man who once commanded one of Canada's most important Air Force bases now spends his days inside concrete walls, separated from the world he once manipulated so effectively. The transformation is astonishing when viewed from a distance. One moment he occupied a position associated with honor, leadership, and national trust. The next, he became a symbol of betrayal and deception. Yet perhaps the most important question this story leaves behind is not where he is today. The more important question is why this case still unsettles people so deeply all these years later. There are many murder cases throughout history. Tragically, violence is not rare. Yet only a handful of cases permanently embed themselves into public consciousness. The Russell Williams case accomplished exactly that because it attacked several assumptions people rely upon every day in order to feel safe. Human beings need predictable rules to function. We need to believe that good people can usually be identified. We need to believe that professionalism reflects integrity. We need to believe that positions of responsibility attract trustworthy individuals. Most of the time, these assumptions work. Society could not operate otherwise. We cannot wake up every morning suspecting every coworker, every neighbor, or every person wearing a uniform. Trust is the invisible infrastructure that holds communities together. But this case exposed an uncomfortable vulnerability within that system. Sometimes trust itself can be exploited. That realization disturbed millions of people because it challenged something fundamental about human psychology. We naturally search for signs that help us determine who is safe and who is dangerous. We examine appearance. We evaluate professions. We listen to reputations built over years. But dangerous individuals often understand those instincts better than anyone else. They learn how to present exactly what society expects to see. In many ways, Russell Williams became an expert in performance. Every salute, every speech, every professional accomplishment strengthened his disguise. Yet the disguise was never his true identity. It was a shield protecting his hidden life. The fact that he maintained that deception for years continues to fascinate psychologists, investigators, and criminologists around the world. Even today, the interrogation conducted by Jim Smith remains one of the most studied examples of investigative psychology ever recorded. Law enforcement agencies, universities, and criminal behavior specialists continue analyzing that footage because it demonstrates a profound truth about human beings. Patience often defeats arrogance. Evidence often defeats manipulation. Calm persistence can dismantle even the most carefully constructed lies. There is something deeply symbolic about that lesson. Throughout his hidden criminal life, Russell Williams relied upon control. He controlled appearances. He controlled schedules. He controlled information. But in the end, He was defeated by individuals who refused to surrender to assumptions. Investigators trusted facts instead of reputation. They trusted evidence instead of status. They trusted the process itself. This case also changed conversations inside military institutions throughout Canada. Organizations everywhere were forced to confront difficult questions about oversight, accountability, and hidden behaviors. No institution wants to imagine that someone in a leadership position could secretly live a completely different life. Yet denial itself can become dangerous. Healthy organizations eventually learned an important lesson from this tragedy. Respect should never eliminate scrutiny. Admiration should never replace accountability. No person should become so untouchable that questions can no longer be asked. Another lasting legacy of this case involves the field of criminal escalation. Experts continue referencing Russell Williams as an example of how dangerous behaviors often grow gradually rather than appearing suddenly. His criminal history did not begin with murder. It began with smaller violations that progressively intensified over time. This pattern matters because it reminds society that obsessive, invasive behavior should never be dismissed as harmless eccentricity. Sometimes seemingly minor crimes represent early warning signs of deeper pathology. Not every burglar becomes a murderer. Not every obsession leads to violence. But persistent patterns deserve serious attention because escalation thrives in silence. Every successful offense teaches offenders dangerous lessons. It teaches them that they can continue. It teaches them they are smarter than everyone else. It teaches them that consequences may never arrive. The longer those beliefs survive, the greater the danger becomes. Yet above all these lessons, above all the psychological analyses and institutional discussions, stand two names that deserve to remain at the center of this story: Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd. It is easy for true crime stories to become consumed by the offender. Media coverage often unintentionally magnifies the perpetrator until victims become secondary characters in their own tragedy. But that is never how these stories should be remembered. Marie-France was a woman dedicated to service, someone who had built an independent life through commitment and hard work. Jessica was a young woman with dreams, relationships, and an entire future waiting ahead of her. Their stories were interrupted, but their value was never defined by the violence that ended them. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of violent crime is the number of invisible losses it creates. We often think only about the lives that were taken, but countless secondary losses exist as well. There are birthdays that never happened. Family gatherings with empty chairs. Future conversations that never occurred. Parents who continue carrying grief for decades. Friends who occasionally hear a song or visit a familiar place and suddenly remember someone who should still be there. Grief does not disappear according to schedules. It changes shape over time, but it never truly leaves. For many families affected by homicide, healing is not about forgetting. It is about learning how to carry memory forward without allowing pain to consume every remaining part of life. There is another lesson buried inside this story that perhaps matters more than any other. Human beings are far more complex than we often want to believe. Complexity itself is not dangerous. In fact, complexity is what makes people extraordinary. But complexity also means that darkness can coexist beside normalcy in ways that are deeply unsettling. This does not mean we should become paranoid or distrustful of everyone around us. Fear cannot become the foundation of healthy societies. Instead, this story encourages balance. Trust people, but never place them beyond accountability. Respect institutions, but never assume institutions are incapable of failure. Admire accomplishments, but never confuse achievement with morality. Perhaps that is why the Russell Williams case continues to resonate so powerfully years later. It shattered illusions while simultaneously reminding people why vigilance matters. It revealed weaknesses within systems while also celebrating the perseverance of investigators who refused to stop searching for answers. Most importantly, it demonstrated that truth has a remarkable ability to survive, even when buried beneath years of deception. Eventually, lies become heavy. Maintaining two separate lives becomes exhausting. Evidence accumulates silently. Tiny details remain behind. Snow preserves tracks. Patterns emerge. Walls collapse. The truth waits patiently because reality can only be hidden for so long. Somewhere in Canada today, life has fully returned to normal for millions of people. Children walk to school. Military aircraft continue taking off from CFB Trenton. Families gather around dinner tables. Neighbors wave to one another while shoveling snow during winter mornings. Ordinary life has reclaimed the spaces once dominated by fear. That may be one of the quietest victories after tragedies like these. Communities endure. Life continues moving forward. Yet every so often, someone remembers this case and pauses for a moment. They remember how astonishing the deception was. They remember how persistent investigators remained. And perhaps most importantly, they remember the names of the women whose lives should have continued far beyond those terrible winter nights. In the end, Russell Williams is not the true center of this story. He is the cautionary lesson surrounding it. The true center will always be the lives that were lost, the families who were forever changed, and the enduring reminder that truth, no matter how deeply hidden, eventually finds its way into the light. Years after a case disappears from front pages, something unusual happens. The world slowly forgets the dates, but it remembers the feeling. The feeling that something impossible once happened. The feeling that certainty can suddenly disappear. The feeling that an ordinary face can conceal an extraordinary darkness. That is exactly what remains after the Russell Williams case. It lingers not because of its brutality alone, but because it permanently altered the way many Canadians understood trust itself. In the years following his conviction, life continued throughout Ontario. Snow still arrived every winter. Families still gathered for holidays. Military aircraft still rose into the sky above CFB Trenton. Children still rode bicycles through neighborhoods that had once been consumed by fear. On the surface, everything returned to normal. But beneath normalcy, memory remained. Memory has a strange way of attaching itself to places. Certain roads never feel exactly the same again. Certain neighborhoods quietly carry pieces of history long after outsiders have forgotten what happened there. Communities heal, but healing is not the same thing as erasing scars. The people who lived through those terrifying months carried invisible reminders that accompanied them into the future. Some became more cautious. Some became more observant. Some found themselves double-checking locks years after the danger had already disappeared. Trauma does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it simply changes habits forever. For many Canadians, the Russell Williams case represented a loss of innocence. Before this case, many people naturally believed danger had a recognizable appearance. They believed dangerous individuals would stand apart from society somehow. Perhaps they would appear unstable, isolated, or obviously suspicious. But this case destroyed that illusion entirely. Russell Williams occupied one of the most respected positions in the country. He wore medals. He gave speeches. He represented professionalism. He moved comfortably through circles built upon honor and responsibility. The contradiction itself became the story. Decades from now, criminology students may not remember every date associated with the investigation, but they will continue studying one question. How did a man with everything continue risking it all for increasingly destructive behavior? The answer is uncomfortable because it reveals something fundamental about unchecked obsession. Obsession rarely remains stationary. It grows. It expands. It demands more over time. At first, boundaries exist. Then boundaries weaken. Eventually, boundaries disappear entirely. Human beings often imagine evil arriving in one catastrophic moment, but evil is frequently incremental. It is a series of small decisions repeated over years. One compromise becomes another. One secret becomes 10. One lie becomes an entire hidden existence. That was the trajectory of Russell Williams. He was not born one day as the infamous criminal Canada would eventually know. He became that person through years of escalating choices that were never interrupted early enough. There is an important lesson hidden inside that reality. Small warning signs matter. Repeated invasive behaviors matter. Patterns matter. We sometimes dismiss troubling actions because they seem minor when viewed individually. But patterns tell stories long before tragedies occur. Patterns reveal momentum. They reveal direction. They reveal risks that are still developing beneath the surface. Had his earlier crimes been connected sooner, perhaps the escalation could have been stopped before reaching its most devastating point. That possibility remains one of the saddest reflections surrounding the entire case. Yet there is another side to this story that deserves attention. The side that reminds people why justice systems exist at all. Because although the deception lasted years, it did not last forever. This was not a story where evil remained undefeated. It was a story about persistence overcoming arrogance. Every major breakthrough happened because investigators refused to become intimidated by reputation. They refused to say, "This person is too important to investigate." They refused to let assumptions replace facts. Instead, they followed evidence wherever it led. That principle may be the most valuable legacy of the entire investigation. Truth has no respect for titles. Truth does not stop at military gates. Truth does not recognize prestige. If evidence points toward someone, evidence deserves to be followed completely, regardless of who that person may be. In many ways, the investigators became guardians of an idea much larger than the case itself. The idea that no individual stands above accountability. Another lasting impact emerged within law enforcement training. The interrogation conducted by Jim Smith became internationally recognized because it demonstrated extraordinary emotional control. Many people expect justice to arrive through anger. Yet anger was never the weapon that solved this case. Patience was. There is something profoundly meaningful about that lesson. The world often celebrates loud victories. But some of the greatest victories happen quietly. A detective sitting calmly across from a suspect. A tire track preserved in snow. A series of notes assembled carefully over countless sleepless nights. Justice is often built through ordinary acts performed consistently over time. That is exactly what happened here. Meanwhile, life for the families of Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd entered a chapter few people ever truly understand unless they have lived through it themselves. There is a misconception that grief eventually ends. It does not. Instead, grief evolves. During the beginning, grief feels overwhelming and impossible to carry. Then slowly, over months and years, people learn how to live alongside it. But even decades later, certain moments reopen old wounds. Birthdays arrive unexpectedly. Holidays create silence where laughter once existed. Family photographs suddenly become more valuable than any possession on earth because they preserve moments that can never happen again. This is perhaps the greatest injustice of violent crime. It does not simply end lives. It steals futures. Futures are invisible losses. Nobody can measure them because they never existed physically. Yet they are enormous. We lose conversations that would have happened. We lose future achievements. We lose future versions of people who never had the opportunity to become who they were supposed to become. Somewhere in another version of reality, Marie-France Comeau continued her life uninterrupted. Somewhere in another version of reality, Jessica Lloyd grew older surrounded by friends and loved ones. But in this reality, those futures vanished. That truth alone explains why remembering victims matters so deeply. True crime can sometimes unintentionally transform offenders into central figures. Their names become famous. Their photographs become recognizable. Their stories dominate documentaries and headlines. Yet that imbalance can become dangerous if society forgets who truly matters. The purpose of revisiting these stories should never be to glorify offenders. It should be to understand warning signs, learn difficult lessons, and honor the people who deserved far better than the endings they received. As years passed, another conversation quietly developed around this case. Mental health experts, behavioral scientists, and criminologists repeatedly examined the concept of compartmentalization. How could one person separate two identities so effectively? The answer remains incomplete because human psychology is extraordinarily complicated. Perhaps that uncertainty itself is part of the lesson. We will never fully understand every darkness hidden inside every human being. Some answers will always remain out of reach. But uncertainty should never lead to hopelessness. Instead, it should encourage awareness. Awareness that no single characteristic guarantees safety. Awareness that accountability must exist everywhere. Awareness that trust and vigilance can coexist together. Those ideas are not contradictory. Healthy societies require both. We should trust one another because trust is essential for human connection. But trust should never become blindness. The two are very different things. If there is one final image that encapsulates this entire story, perhaps it is not the interrogation room. Perhaps it is not the courtroom either. Perhaps it is something much simpler. A quiet winter road in Ontario. Snow covering the ground. Silence stretching across neighborhoods where people believed they were safe. Hidden within that snow were tire tracks. Tiny impressions left behind by someone convinced he had perfected invisibility. He had spent years building an illusion that appeared impossible to destroy. Yet ultimately, that illusion was defeated by details. There is something strangely hopeful about that realization. No matter how powerful deception becomes, reality continues existing underneath it. Reality leaves traces. Reality waits patiently. Reality eventually surfaces. That may be the final message this story leaves behind. Evil can be intelligent. It can be organized. It can be patient. But it is never invincible. Eventually, every lie grows heavy. Every hidden life becomes difficult to sustain. Every mask begins to crack. And when those cracks finally appear, truth has a way of pouring through them all at once. Today, Russell Williams sits inside prison walls, far removed from the influence he once possessed. The titles are gone. The authority is gone. The illusion is gone. But the lessons remain. Remember the victims. Respect evidence more than reputation. Never ignore patterns that suggest escalation. And never forget that some of the most important victories in justice are won not through force, but through persistence. Because in the end, this story was never truly about one man's rise and fall. It was about the resilience of communities, the determination of investigators, the enduring strength of grieving families, and the simple but powerful truth that no matter how carefully darkness hides itself, eventually, somewhere, someone will turn on the light.